We thought we'd just start by kind of introducing ourselves a tiny bit more, just to say that this is kind of connected to some of our other research, but also quite a new area for us. So we're both historians by training. I work on the sort of 20th century Britain social and cultural history, and have worked with museums, but we're coming at it from a kind of different angle, and the team is really interdisciplinary in that sense. So kind of cultural studies, history of medicine, social history, and then Abigail and Simon bring another element as well, kind of heritage studies.
And that kind of fits in with the sort of broad project which Laura and I are both part of at the University of Leeds, which is the Arts Engage project. So we are 2 of 5 research fellows who have a kind of dual role. Half of our time is spent on original academic research of our own, and the other 50% of our time is encouraging a kind of culture of collaboration and engagement between higher education and non-HEIs. And it's really sort of that area of our sort of academic interest and our academic work which gives the kind of basis, the foundation to our involvement with this particular project. I should mention that each of the 5 fellows has a particular sort of area of interest with regard to engagement. Mine is with museums, galleries and heritage organisations, and Laura works with the cultural and creative industries. So there's really quite a lot of overlap in terms of what we're examining as far as this project is concerned on our own work-based interests. So what we're going to give you now is kind of it's an overview of the document which was circulated, but we're also going to at the end suggest where this might take us next, and hopefully that will stimulate some of the discussion which we'll have later during the day. And we're going to concentrate on the sort of key 6 areas which emerged mostly from the questionnaire, as Paul mentioned, but also try to tie that in with some of the academic literature. And one of the things which we're particularly going to highlight is a slight disjunct between the focus of the academic literature and the experience of practitioners working in the sector with digital technologies.
So, as we say, we'll take you through the critical review. Hopefully you've had time to have a look through it, but obviously this is a kind of refresher. And to start with the kind of methodology that Paul's touched on really, but just to confirm that this is a survey of literature, but by that we don't just mean kind of what goes on in journals and the academic literature. We're also looking at reports, kind of grey literature, blogs and commentaries of different types from different sectors. So it's hopefully a synthesis of some different areas. And it's also a synthesis of different kinds of writing from academic disciplines. So from history, ideas about public history, for example, from heritage studies, a little bit even from kind of areas of computing in that digital world. So drawing together those different areas. And secondly, as we've said, we've had a questionnaire that's been online for 6 weeks now, I suppose. We've dealt with 104 responses from that. I think there might be a few more now, so it's a fair sample already. And we've got the project blog, as we've already said. So it's drawing together a kind of different types of methodologies to try and understand both academic perspectives on digital engagement and also what's going on in the sector.
And one of the, and this is perhaps, as we suggested in our initial document, kind of an obvious point which emerged from a lot of the responses, in fact, is that when it comes to using digital technologies, it's important that they are used in appropriate ways, that actually projects which have a digital element or a digital focus are done well. And this is perhaps a view which might not just be echoed in the sector, but also from the kinds of audiences which the sector is aiming to engage with. So audience groups, educationalists, people who are really trying to engage with audiences, they're kind of concerned with making sure that digital does its job, that the money which is ploughed into digital tools and digital techniques for engaging audiences gives value. So when we're thinking about the cultural value of digital engagement, that leads kind of naturally onto questions about whether digital engagement itself actually gives economic value. So does the digital give value for money? And if so, in what way is it then a kind of a tool for enhancement? So one of the questions here is, how can we support colleagues working in the sector to ensure that these new digital projects do give value for money. What is necessary in terms of training and of technical support to make sure that when digital technologies appear within museum and heritage context, that they offer real value for money.
So a second kind of key theme that came up in many of the questionnaire responses and is also touched on in some of the literature is essentially whether digital engagement and working with digital technologies offers simply another tool in the curator's toolbox, as we've called it, whether it's just simply another way of working or whether it offers something qualitatively different for both professionals and for audiences engaging with heritage in a museum or remotely. So this leads on to questions of relative value. So it's not just economic value, but relative value. How do digital tools compare to the value of other tools? And that is connected to economic value, but also slightly separate. And so this links to another key theme in the questionnaire responses of how the use of digital technology must be appropriate. It must be used in the right situation for the right kind of visitors and shouldn't just be used kind of willy-nilly. This related to a number of ways in which digital tools were said to enhance individuals' experience. So these included things like providing an additional or more in-depth information, or to stimulate a process of finding out more, so getting that visitor then go away and find out more. The digital tools in museums and remotely also opened up new areas, so such as collections that weren't on display in a museum or other site, and also allowed visitors with different needs to engage more thoroughly, so those with access needs or non-English speakers. Thirdly, the digital can encourage input from visitors and the possibility for a greater dialogue between visitors and collections, exhibits and curators, which is very interesting and I think going to be quite an important part of this critical review. And fourthly, the digital tools available encourage a new type of close relationship with the history in question, so a new kind of level of interactivity and engagement. And some also noted, quite interestingly, that the use of digital technology by heritage professionals can help make a case for the value of heritage and history more generally. So it's also a kind of PR tool. So we're coming on to the question with all of this really is, does the digital make more possible? Is it just extending the remit? Or does it represent a wholly different kind of engagement with the past? I think that's something that we could discuss today.
But in addition to the ways in which digital might allow us to rethink current relationships with heritage or open up new ones, there is also this kind of issue bound up with the use of digital technologies, which is, what does it actually do to the heritage in question? So this is the kind of what we've termed the medium versus the message, and this was a kind of issue brought out in a number of the questionnaire responses, where audiences became what was termed entranced by the digital medium itself, rather than focusing on the message which that digital medium was actually using. So this kind of leads us on to questions about the location of cultural value when it comes to using digital tools and heritage. So is the value located within the digital representations or the digital engagement, or is it located within the process of using the digital technology? And I think this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about some of the academic literature on the relationship between the physical and the digital. So at the moment, the academic literature has tended to characterize physical and digital representations as somehow qualitatively different, that they are different versions of the same thing. But what we want to kind of explore and interrogate a little bit more is how that is realized in practice. When museum visitors are actually encountering digital forms of heritage and using digital tools to access heritage, Are they focusing less on the heritage because it's being presented in a digital way? And I think that's kind of it's an important practical question when it comes to designing and thinking about how we're going to integrate digital technologies within a museum context. I should highlight here as well that whilst a lot of the academic literature tends to focus on either digital tools within a museum or digital tools which can be used remotely, we're looking at that in kind of a slightly more fluid way, thinking about how digital transformations can occur either in person or remotely, and whether digital tools actually encourage people to engage remotely, having had those sort of initial encounters within the museum and vice versa.
So, seeing as we're talking about organisations concerned with history and heritage in some way, a key further theme is about time. So this would be very different for, I think, museums solely connected with, or organisations connected with more contemporary issues. But most of our respondents have talked about how the digital can be in some way incongruous with the historical nature of the content. So in this regard, it connects to some key aspects of the literature, particularly Ross Parry's work, who's a very important person in at least the British context. And he said that there's a danger really of fetishising the future through digital engagement. So moving away from a focus on the past and thinking about the future. This relates to concerns about the use of digital technology in heritage sites more broadly. So does it, again, detract from the value of that history, but with that anachronism? So a digital tool might result in a kind of anachronism. And that was particularly so for people responding to our questionnaire who worked in historical sites rather than museums, so historical palaces or other kinds of buildings. So how can digital technologies be integrated there in effective ways that don't seem incongruous with the historical nature of that site? This leads on to a point about whether digital technologies should be integrated into the experience or remain separate from it. And this was a really divisive point in our questionnaire survey. Some people felt it had to remain slightly separate, so that detraction from the value of the historical experience, that physical historical experience, didn't happen. It should remain separate. But others felt the only way to achieve the maximum value of that experience was to fully integrate them in clever ways. So again, that's a question that we'd like to think about, I think, today. And I think this relates to something else that we might discuss, which is who decides what is valuable. So, so far we've got as far as analysing the literature and analysing questionnaire respondents who are all professionals in the field. But how much do we know about what visitors actually feel about what's value? What precise value do the public get from interaction with the real thing? And how can digital engagement complement this without acting as a detractor?
And that kind of leads us on to a question which is brought up kind of time and again, which is the potential, at least, for digital technologies to offer museum visitors and people engaging with heritage the opportunity to inform interpretations of heritage and also to construct their own narratives. So this is digital technology as an enabling device, which kind of removes the what's often seen as a barrier or a kind of a void between the expertise and the knowledge of the curator and the experiences of the museum visitor. So here the literature really focuses on how digital technologies can offer the opportunity for enhanced value, which is achieved through visitors' participation in the creation of new stories around heritage. Nina Simon's work, however, has kind of drawn a few critiques together of this. So she highlights that very often, whilst the intentions are to allow visitors the space to interpret exhibits for themselves and to inform future work within the heritage sector, often this feedback loop, which she calls it, is both complex and occasionally broken. That there is a lot of information provided by visitors, but it's not clear at the moment that it's used in appropriate ways in order to realise that true value. There are practical questions here, of course, as well, for those working in the sector. So it's all well and good to invite responses to exhibits or invite co-creation and co-curation of work within museums. But it's quite another thing to deal with the mass of data, which very often this gives you. So questions which we're interested in here are how can those working in the sector best use the digital tools to acquire data which is relevant for their own work, and how can museum visitors and people engaging with heritage make and effect a real change in heritage practices to open this up to new audiences. And here I think it's particularly kind of this ties together with our focus on international understandings of heritage, because there are particular socio-cultural contexts where it's more relevant to open up heritage and allow people a greater ownership of heritage with which they might have a particularly personal connection.
And that leads us on to the sixth and final kind of key theme that has emerged so far. And this is, I think, where particularly where we'd really value input from colleagues from working in the sector at the moment, because this was a theme that was less emerging from the questionnaire responses so far and more emerging from the literature, unlike the other 5 themes which were quite important in the questionnaire responses. But this theme we've entitled Place, Personal and Public. And I think there's 2 issues there really that we're getting at. One is that essentially the digital experience can feel a bit ungrounded and placeless. Does it kind of remove us from the sense of space and place that might be quite important and quite a valuable experience of engagement with heritage? And the personal and public element of this, I think, gets at the idea of whether digital engagement can lead to a more positive, personalised experience of heritage, and whether that can add to the value. Or, on the other hand, a couple of articles and 1 or 2 questionnaire respondents actually highlighted that a digital experience can actually very much narrow that person down, very practically if they're looking at a smartphone, for example, whilst going through a museum space, or just by personalising it so they don't have the same experience as someone else. So does that lead to an experience that isn't kind of shared and doesn't lead to interaction with other people? So again, something for us to think about. And clearly this is a particularly important one when thinking about a wholly digital interaction, a remote digital interaction rather than an interaction within some kind of heritage or history site. And this also kind of relates to how people experience value within their engagement with history. A couple of articles, particularly a couple of case studies, have really found that the value people get out of engaging with the past is often through that personal interaction. So we might think here of connections to family history and genealogy and the emotional kind of value that people get out of exploring that. And whether that's a kind of important context for thinking about how museums might encourage people to engage with the discussions within their own spaces. But that's very much a kind of theme that we're exploring in the literature at the moment, so we'd really like to discuss that with you.
So just to draw together some things which are kind of common to the 6 themes which we've already highlighted. First of all, I think that in the main, when we're thinking about comparing what we found in our initial literature review with feedback which we got through the questionnaire, we see quite a significant discrepancy between what are seen as key central issues for theoreticians talking about the digital and heritage and those working in the sector. So there are issues of scale in particular. So when you look for case studies within the literature of digital engagement, they tend to be very, very large scale. They talk about large digitalization and digital engagement projects, many of which are out of reach of the numerous small-scale heritage and museum organisations, particularly those which are new and working on collections which perhaps haven't been as well developed or aren't as long standing. And allied to that, there's problems of specialist knowledge as well. It's often assumed within some of the academic literature that specialist knowledge about the use of digital technologies is something which is quite common across the sector. What we found is that actually people are, generally speaking, within the sector having to seek new skill, having to develop some of their existing skills and bring in specialists in digital technologies who might themselves not have the requisite experience of heritage. So it's about the bringing together of different types of expertise. One thing which I think was common to virtually all of the questionnaires and relates back to all of the points which we've been talking about is the problem with workload, which is thrown up by the use of digital tools. So it's all well and good for us to discuss the cultural and relative economic value which these tools can provide to visitors and people who are engaging with heritage. But that's not really of much practical use in actually deploying these if curators don't have the time to ensure that these projects are realised to their full potential. So there's a question about how workloads for curators and people working within heritage and digital development are actually managed. And of course there is still the ongoing debate both within the academic literature and in the sector about what digital tools can actually offer to heritage audiences. So do they really encourage a more open way of accessing the past? Do they actually allow people who are having these heritage encounters to be more creative with their own heritage and the heritage which they perhaps share with other groups? Or do they instead offer a more narrow understanding, a more narrow and personal and less transferable form of heritage? And in amongst all this, there are debates about whether using digital technologies to a greater or lesser extent actually reduces the integrity of heritage by focusing on the digital encounter as the primary object of value for the people who are experiencing heritage.
So that's some of the kind of key themes that have emerged for us and that are contained in this critical review so far. But I think what we're interested in doing today is talking, as Paul said, we're interested in kind of being quite critical, a critical review. So it's not just about the potential, it's about some of the challenges and some of the questions that this raises, whether it is, you know, good for the sector to be engaging with these digital tools. And our longer critical review, I think, will talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that were identified in the questionnaire, everything from those practical ones around time and money, and also organisational structures was another big thing of how to persuade different parts of organisations to get on board with this. To wider questions of, as I say, whether it is valuable. But we're also interested in being critical of this review today. So we really welcome your input today and tell us, you know, this is the idea of having the workshop, I think, halfway through the project, is that we can really get your input and we can really rework this out of the discussions that have come about today. As well as that, we're also going to be spending the next couple of months doing some more reading. So our reading so far has been exploratory, and I think we're going to really knuckle down and explore some particular areas that I think are missing, or we think that will help us think through some of these issues. We're going to be gathering more data through the questionnaire, so as Paul said, please do that if you haven't already, and please spread the word if you know of any colleagues who might be interested in taking part. We might also have the chance to do some informal interviews depending on time, but the podcasts I think will be really valuable for that, so we'll get some reflections on the blog as well. And we'll also be disseminating the findings at conferences online on our website and sending the final critical review out to you and other professionals as appropriate. But we also want to know not only if you whether you think the key themes that are emerging so far are the most important to you, and whether you have any comments on those, but also what would be most helpful for you next. So tell us if, you know, a one-page summary would be the most helpful thing to disseminate to colleagues, or, you know, both format and content I think we're interested in today. So I think that wraps up our initial presentation, and we've got a few minutes, I think, for some should we have some initial questions now? Any kind of specific questions, then we can have presentations of fuller responses.
First of all, thank you very much for a great presentation. Really good overview, and I guess now we're going
You raised the question there whether we should regard digital elements as being secondary, but they are quite capable of being primary works in their own right, and the digital artworks can be the only manifestation of that project, of that work. So there's a whole category of things there that is solely digital.
That's totally right, and
yeah,
I think
absolutely.
That's where there's a really interesting overlap, I think, between historians and archival practice and museums, clearly, of how do we deal with, in the last 10 or so years or more, things that are actually solely digital, and does that have a different kind of interaction? And I think one of the key elements of the literature is getting beyond that idea of a binary division between the object and its digital representation. So maybe, as you say, that solely digital might help us also answer that, I guess.
Yes, it adds to that picture, I think.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. Is there anything we can clarify, or any kind of initial comments?
I'd really like to get some thoughts on, the relationship between the physical and the digital. I mean, there are lots of things about the notion of the sort of born digital stuff, isn't there? Which also have kind of questions of protection. How do we kind of protect digital ephemera in the world of the internet, where things are changing all the time? So there's a whole bunch of issues there. But one thing I thought was quite interesting about this notion of how the digital can kind of allow increased access to, sort of as a shop window, trying to get more people to engage with physical heritage. But one of the things that talking to colleagues around the places is also it can kind of work in the other way. It can kind of also operate as a kind of way of protecting the physical. So you give people straightforward access to the digital, and then that stops people having to kind of get their hands on the kind of material. And how it'd be interesting to I mean, these are kind of, I suppose, ethical questions about how we engage with our heritage. It'd be really interesting to hear what colleagues think about.
I think definitely that, and also the fact that you potentially might have something that looks quite dull and is a huge big volume with loads of pages in that people will just walk past, but actually there's one bit in it that's really important that you can use digital to bring that out. So whereas somebody might walk past something, if it's just a snippet that you haven't got space to display the whole thing, or it's not practical, then you can use it to really highlight something.
One of that kind of links with a theme which we're interested in exploring, which is what the digital enables you to do with objects which are otherwise kind of lack that appeal and that ability to engage. But of course there are rationales about selection and about presentation there as well. So it's about kind of viewing the digital as an enabling device, where nevertheless curatorial selections and discretion has to be applied in order to kind of realise that and make it happen.
That was a really interesting point of the questionnaire, though, having said that, is that to my mind, very few people talked about those points about preserving, and protecting the real object. And I don't know whether that's because it's so obvious that that's what the digital can do, and maybe that's right. But it was quite surprising that only a handful of people really talked about that in any depth. And I wonder, and that is really connected to a question of value, of whether there is an inherent value of engaging with the real thing that the digital can never achieve.
Yes. I can give you an example of that. I mean, we've got a large collection of bird skins, about 70,000 bird skins from all over the world, collected over the last 2 or 3, about 250 years, certainly. And we have pictures of them, and we have a database of them, and so on. But what people want to do is to take DNA samples from those skins, and they have to go to the skin in order to collect that material. And that's the intrinsic value of the actual object. There's embedded information there that we can never realistically hope to digitize in its entirety. There's work there to be done on remains.
I wondered, I made that comment in the review, but I wonder whether it's about who would answer the survey, because I think if you ask more conservators, collections managers, you probably get a different response, and they focus more on those presentations.
And I mean, it's interesting to note that actually we gathered quite a few responses from people who identified themselves as having primary responsibility for the digital aspect of heritage within their organisation, and there was a skew in terms of what they felt their focus was compared with curatorial staff. There was definitely something there, and I think that kind of points back to the point which Laura made, and which I know is kind of felt within the sector about organisational structures. So it's important that these kind of groups who are trying to get to grips with digital technologies from their relative perspective have kind of meaningful and common dialogue, because I think otherwise there's a danger of kind of entrenchment almost, that you have people whose primary responsibility is to the objects and to their inherent physical nature, and then you have another group of people whose primary responsibility is to work with that as a base product, as something to use creatively, and I think it's very important that actually within the academic literature that is raised as a significant, not necessarily a barrier, but certainly something which influences the way that digital technology is viewed.
I mean, you talked about it really well in the review, but and it's there within the literature, but in terms of your survey, I'm thinking about the audience voice, because we talk a lot about how much digital activity at the moment is around co-production, it's about engaging communities, but we're not engaging the community in response to a critical review. And it's only, I know I'm part of the project, and it's only now that it's sort of really dawned on me, but I think that's the nature of sitting together, that how we're going to engage that voice beyond, because they are obviously the consumers, but also the generators.
So that's why we're interested in, and that's why we're having it now, so we can get input into things like that. And is it more useful for us to go away and try and do a questionnaire of people who've maybe visited your museums, the people that are here, or your different sites, rather than spend hours, trawling through the rest of the literature? So I think, we're kind of open, aren't we, to...
I think we definitely need to look at that angle, and not just visitors, but, people within education that are looking at things what's available and how much they use that. And something I thought about is just dwell time. Do people spend longer, if they've got... So that's where your benefit is, that they might... it's more engrossing when you spend longer actually going through some of this stuff than you might do just looking at them. So it's just those kind of things. I think it makes sense really.
We're kind of limited with time and resources to an extent, but I think it is a really important part.
And I don't think you have to generate it yourself.
No.
I think museums are incredibly brilliant at doing evaluation.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So exploring some of the evaluation very much from the lens of what was the benefit, what was the disadvantage of the digital, and then you could look at adding on a single question to a piece of evaluation that's already planned to take place on a digital project. I think many of them are
I was just going to add to that point. I don't know, one of the companies we're working with is called Bright White. They're doing a lot of work with the Glasgow School of Arts, with the recreating the Battle of Bannockburn. I can't remember exactly where, but there's a museum open there, and they've done a lot of research from audiences of different ages to see how the technology they've used, how that's helped them to engage with the past. And I haven't got the exact details, but I can put you in touch with them. They've actually said how it varies from the younger audiences to the older ones, saying that the digital, well, basically I think he said something like the use of digital is for kids only. And that's the sort of feedback, and he said it's been quite interesting, and also the way the audiences have responded through different forms of digital media. Younger people using a lot more Facebook to respond. I think he said something like TripAdvisor for the older people have come through, where they're giving their feedback on it. So, but I can put you in touch with obviously what they've done. Might be something like you just said, you don't have to do the work yourself.
That'd be great. I mean, one of the documents which I came across, it's only published last month, is the report which has been taken up, I think, very enthusiastically by the Scottish Government, looking at how users generally engage with digital technologies across Scotland, and it would be very interesting to kind of triangulate that against the heritage experiences. So whether the context of heritage somehow affects people's likelihood or desire to engage with those kind of mediums. So yeah, those kind of avenues are absolutely ones that we should be exploring. Yeah.
I just wanted to add something around that idea of the voice of the audience as well, because the audience is obviously, yes, the consumer, it's also the creator in some senses, but also ultimately it's the funder. And I think the responsibility of institutions in relation to the people who pay their wages and support the organisations on the whole as well is something that might come into this as well. It's slightly obscure.
And that's one of the challenges of using evaluation, because of course so much evaluation will not be published, because we often evaluate and then share what works with the funding body, for example. But I mean, museums are always incredibly generous in sharing the non-published work. So it's just finding it is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's a lot of potential evaluation which isn't exploited properly, and just in terms of things like log files, web analytics and so on. And they're files, but they're not analysed, they're not dissected, not thought about as thoroughly as I would like to see, certainly. And that's because of time. We just don't have time to do that. But I really feel there's a body of information there that we can learn from enormously.
Yeah, in all sorts of interesting, creative ways as well. You know, not just for evaluation, but for creation of new work.
Yes.
You know?
Oh yes. Yes. Guide new work, certainly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's obviously your study's short and compact, so you are focusing more on heritage sites and museum collections rather than heritage information. But I think there's a fundamental difference between the way people expect to interact with visiting a museum or a gallery. You expect to look at something in a showcase. If you want to do research into historical archival material, for example, or books, you expect to handle it, you expect to interrogate it, you expect to be asking questions about its authenticity. And there's a much greater interaction and engagement with that source perhaps than you would simply by purely looking at something in a showcase and or having a digital interpretation of that. So I think that's also an interesting aspect if you're looking at evaluation from users. What are their expectations of it?
That might be a beautiful segue into the next session. So thank you very much for that. I mean, I think that's been a really, really useful opening discussion, and I'm sure that this is these themes will emerge over the course of the day. But I think that's very good. I mean, the one thing that I guess I would say as well, that we've got to be pragmatic, haven't we? Because we've only got until the end of June to write the report. But I think that if there's material out there that we can kind of look at and try to exploit, and if you guys can help us find that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.